The dust of redemption settled in layers of fine red powder that coated everything the unpainted clapboard of the general store, the sweaty flanks of tethered horses, and the strained hope on the faces of its people. It was a town clinging to existence on the sun-scorched canvas of the New Mexico territory, a place where survival was a daily negotiation with the unforgiving land. For Viola Barnes, that negotiation had become a quiet art. Inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and lukewarm coffee. Viola stood at the teller's window, her posture straight a habit from a life she had been forced to abandon in Virginia. She pushed a small canvas bag of coins across the polished wood. "For my account, Mr. Gable." The teller, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched by financial anxiety, offered a thin smile. "Good week, Mrs. Barnes. Seems Mrs. Rodriguez's new son arrived safely." "He did," Viola confirmed, a flicker of pride warming her. A strong boy. Her life was measured in such victories. A fever broken a bone, set a new life brought into the world. Each success added a few more coins to her account, a few more bricks to the fragile wall of security she was building around herself and her 6-year-old daughter, Catherine. Suddenly, the lazy afternoon calm shattered. The bank's doors flew open with a violent crack, and 3 men stormed inside, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. The townsfolk, a mix of ranchers and merchants, froze in a collective gasp. The leader, a tall man with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky, moved with a chilling economy of motion. He held a Colt revolver with the casual authority of a man for whom violence was a trade. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," he announced, his voice a low, controlled rasp that cut through the panicked silence. "This is a withdrawal, not a massacre." His men efficiently herded the customers against the far wall while he approached the teller's cage. Mr. Gable's hands trembled as he raised them. Viola, caught between the counter and the wall, tried to make herself small, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of Catherine, safe at their small adobe home just outside of town, and a primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. The leader ignored the teller for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the terrified customers. His eyes, intelligent and unnervingly perceptive, stopped on Viola. He saw not a frightened woman, but a challenge. Her chin was still lifted, her eyes wide but defiant. He walked toward her, the jingle of his spurs the only sound in the suffocating quiet. "You," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You don't look like you belong here. Too much polish for a place called Redemption." He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the leather and sweat on him. His gaze dropped to the silver locket resting against the collar of her dress, a simple oval she never removed. "What's in there?" Viola's hand flew instinctively to the locket. It was her most precious possession, the only tangible link to Catherine's father, to the man she had once loved with a desperate, all-consuming passion. "It's nothing," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just a keepsake." "Keepsakes are for people with pasts they like to remember," he countered. "Open it." When she hesitated, his hand shot out, not grabbing the locket, but closing gently around her wrist. The touch was not violent, but it was absolute, a silent promise of force that made her blood run cold. "I won't ask again." With trembling fingers, Viola unclasped the chain and opened the locket. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a miniature portrait, a painstakingly detailed painting of a handsome young man with dark, laughing eyes and a charming, reckless smile. It was Elias Thorne. The robber stared at the portrait, and the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. The cold calculation in his eyes was replaced by something far more terrifying. A surge of raw, white-hot fury so profound it was like looking into the heart of a forge. His breath hissed through his teeth. "Elias," he murmured the name, a ghost on his lips. He looked from the portrait back to Viola, his expression twisting into a mask of glacial hatred. He finally understood. He snatched the locket from her hand, the delicate chain snapping. He ignored her stifled gasp, pocketing the silver oval. Turning back to the teller's cage, he pointed at the bags of money his men had collected. "Leave it." His men stared bewildered. "But Silas," one began. "I said, leave it." The leader, Silas Thorne, repeated his voice, now laced with steel. He walked to the door, pausing to look back at Viola, who stood paralyzed, her hand clutching the empty space on her chest where the locket had been. "Some debts," Silas Thorne said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent bank, "are paid in more than gold." Then he was gone, vanishing with his men into the blinding New Mexico sun, leaving behind a baffled town and a woman whose carefully constructed world had just been torn apart by a ghost from a past she thought she had buried forever. The weeks following the robbery were a blur of quiet dread for Viola. The town buzzed with theories about the strange outlaws who had taken a worthless locket and left behind a fortune. But Viola knew the truth was a secret she could share with no one. Silas Thorne's chilling recognition of Elias, his brother, meant the past was not just a memory. It was a predator, and it was now hunting her. The stress settled deep in her bones, a constant low-grade fever of anxiety that frayed her nerves and stole her sleep. She poured her energy into her work and into Catherine, hoping that routine could build a fortress against the encroaching fear. Their small adobe homestead, nestled between red rock formations and sparse juniper trees, had always been a sanctuary. Now every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. "Mama, you're not listening." Catherine's voice cut through Viola's anxious thoughts one evening. The child sat at their small kitchen table, a piece of charcoal in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sketched a picture of a horse. Viola forced a smile, shaking off the dark premonitions. "I'm sorry, my sweet girl. I was just thinking." About the bad man, Catherine asked, her eyes so unnervingly, like Elias's, full of a child's direct perception. The robbery had terrified her, and Viola had spent countless nights holding her, soothing her nightmares. The incident had left a mark, a shadow on her daughter's normally bright spirit. "No, sweetheart. I was thinking about how much I love you, but it was a lie." She was thinking of Silas Thorne, of the venom in his eyes, and of the promise or threat in his final words. She was a healer, a woman who mended broken bodies, but she had no remedy for a broken past. The fragile piece of their life was shattered a week later. It began subtly. Catherine, usually a whirlwind of energy, became listless. Her rosy cheeks grew pale, and she barely touched her food. Viola recognized the early signs of illness, the subtle shift in a body's balance. She administered willow bark tea for the low fever and brewed comforting broths, confident she could nurse her daughter back to health as she had done for so many others. This time, however, her knowledge was not enough. Catherine's condition deteriorated with alarming speed. The low fever spiked, becoming a raging fire that consumed her small body. She trembled with violent chills, her breathing growing labored and shallow. The town doctor, a pompous man who viewed Viola's healing practice with disdain, offered no help. "It's a summer fever," he declared after a cursory examination. "She'll either fight it off or she won't. These things are in God's hands." Viola knew better. This was not a simple fever. It was something fierce and aggressive, something that felt as if it were fueled by the very stress and fear that had plagued them since the robbery. Desperate, she spent 2 days and nights by Catherine's bedside, consulting her worn, leather-bound medical journal, a relic from her life in Virginia. She tried every remedy she knew, every combination of herbs, every cooling compress. Nothing worked. Catherine was slipping away. "Please hold on, Viola," whispered her voice, cracking as she pressed her lips to her daughter's burning forehead. "I'll find something to help you. I promise." Her promise felt hollow and empty sound against the relentless advance of the illness. On the third morning, as dawn painted the sky, in cruel, beautiful hues of rose and gold. Viola found her answer not in her journal, but in a whispered memory. Mrs. Rodriguez, the woman whose baby she had just delivered, had once spoken of an Apache remedy for fierce fevers, a rare herb called golden seal, which grew only when combined with a specific blue flower found near a hidden waterfall in Coyote Canyon. The canyon was dangerous, a contested territory where the cavalry's recent incursions had stirred up trouble with the local Apache. To go there was to risk everything. But looking at her daughter small and frail against the sweat-soaked pillows, Viola knew she had no choice. Her role as a healer was eclipsed by the far more powerful instinct of a mother. She would walk into any danger, face any threat to save her child. She arranged for her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez, to watch over Catherine. The woman's weathered face creased with concern as she took Viola's hands. "Be careful, mija," Mrs. Hernandez warned, her voice thick with worry. "The Apache have been seen near the waterfall. They are not in a welcoming mood." "I'll be cautious," Viola promised, tucking a small knife into her boot. As she saddled her horse, her gaze fell on the empty space on her dresser, where the locket had always rested. Silas Thorne had taken more than a piece of silver. He had stolen her link to the past, and in doing so had unleashed a new terror upon her present. The illness that gripped Catherine felt like a direct consequence, a physical manifestation of the dread that had haunted their home since that day. The journey to Coyote Canyon was not just a search for medicine. It was an act of defiance, a desperate fight against the encroaching darkness. The high sun beat down on Viola's shoulders, a physical weight that shimmered above the cracked earth. The trail to Coyote Canyon was little more than a suggestion, a faint path winding through a sprawling canvas of sun-scorched mesas and canyons, where the wind whispered forgotten Apache legends. Every step her horse took was a prayer, every beat of her heart a frantic rhythm of maternal desperation. After hours of climbing through the rugged terrain, a new sound reached her ears, faint at first, then growing stronger, the rush of falling water. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through her. She followed the sound through a narrow passage between towering red rocks, her horse picking its way carefully over the uneven ground. The sight that greeted her as she emerged into the hidden canyon stole her breath. A waterfall cascaded down a sheer cliff face, tumbling into a crystal-clear pool surrounded by an oasis of lush green vegetation. But it was not the unexpected beauty that made her freeze. It was the man standing beneath the cascade. He was an Apache warrior, chest deep in the pool, the water streaming down his powerful copper-skinned torso. His long black hair clung to broad shoulders as he performed what appeared to be a ritual, cleansing his movements, fluid and purposeful. Strange marking symbols Viola didn't recognize adorned his upper arms. Instinctively, she pressed herself and her horse back into the shadows of the rock passage, her heart pounding. She should have been afraid. Everything she had been taught, every whispered rumor in town, screamed that this man was a threat. Yet what she felt was not fear, but a profound sense of awe. There was a dignity in his bearing, a harmony with the wilderness around him that made him seem as much a part of the landscape as the ancient rocks and the life-giving water. He belonged here. She was the intruder. When he turned slightly, she saw his profile, a strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to hold the depth of the water itself. She knew she should leave, find the herbs, and return to Catherine. But she was transfixed, a reluctant witness to a moment that felt sacred and intensely private. As she finally tried to retreat, her horse's hoof dislodged a small stone. The tiny sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet canyon. Instantly, the warrior turned his body, tensing water droplets flying from his hair. His hand moved to where a knife would have been, but finding nothing, he simply stood tall, unashamed of his near-nakedness, his gaze scanning the rocks. His eyes, dark and piercing, met hers across the distance. Viola couldn't breathe. She was caught exposed. Those eyes held her captive not with menace, but with an inexplicable intensity, a flicker of something that felt almost like recognition, though they had never met. The warrior made no move toward her. He simply studied her, his gaze unwavering, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face. Her clothing, the fear and determination warring in her expression. Viola began, but the word died in her throat. In that suspended moment, with the sound of the waterfall filling the space between them, she was acutely aware of her own heartbeat thundering in her chest like a stampede. The spell was broken by the sharp cry of a hawk circling high above. The sound jolted Viola back to reality. She turned her horse and fled, scrambling back through the rocky passage, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and something else she couldn't name. Only when she was a safe distance away did she stop, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had forgotten the herbs. Blast it all, she muttered, forcing herself to be calm. Catherine's life depended on her courage. Taking a deep breath, she turned back. When she returned to the waterfall, the warrior was gone. The only evidence he had been there were the damp prints of his bare feet on the flat rocks by the pool's edge. With a sense of urgency, Viola began her search. She quickly located the golden seal growing near the water, its distinctive leaves, just as Mrs. Rodriguez had described. But the blue flower, the vital second ingredient, remained elusive. As the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and red, desperation clawed at her. "You search for medicine." The deep voice came from behind her, so close it made her whirl around, nearly losing her balance on the slippery rocks. The Apache warrior stood several paces away, now dressed in buckskin leggings and a vest, his hair tied back with a simple leather thong. His English, though accented, was clear. "How did you—" She began, her hand instinctively going to the knife in her boot. "Your hands," he said, simply gesturing toward her movements as she had gathered the golden seal. "They are the hands of a healer." Viola straightened, lifting her chin. "My daughter is sick. A fierce fever. I need the blue flower that grows here." The warrior considered her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The flower you seek does not grow here anymore. The sky has forgotten how to weep upon this land." Viola's hope collapsed. She had come all this way, risked so much only to fail. Before the despair could fully take hold, he continued, "But I know where it still lives. On the far side of the canyon." "Please," Viola said, the word catching in her throat. "I need it. I will pay you." "Why should I help you?" he asked, his tone flat, without emotion. "Your people bring only destruction to this land and to mine. I'm not—" Viola stopped herself. She couldn't deny her heritage, couldn't pretend she wasn't one of his people. Instead, she spoke the only truth that mattered. "I'm just a mother trying to save her child." Something shifted in his dark eyes, a flicker of empathy that transcended the chasm between their worlds. "How old?" he asked. 6, Viola whispered. The warrior was silent for so long she thought he would refuse. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he turned. "Follow." He led her over terrain she would never have attempted alone, moving with a silent grace that made her own progress feel clumsy and loud. She struggled to keep up, her city-bred lungs straining in the thin mountain air. "Do you have a name?" she asked, gathering her courage. He glanced back at her. "Hotar." "What does it mean?" "It means strong," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "I'm Viola Barnes." "Viola," he repeated, the name sounding different in his mouth, softer, almost musical. He stopped and looked at her. "The white woman who helps birth babies for the Mexican farmers." She was surprised. "You know of me. My people know all who live on these lands," Hotar said simply. "Even those who think themselves hidden." They finally reached a sheltered alcove high on the canyon wall. There, growing from a crack in the rock, was a cluster of delicate blue flowers. "The sky tears," Hotar said. "Use 3 petals only. More will kill instead of heal." As Viola carefully harvested the precious blooms, her hands shaking with relief, she turned to thank him. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "From the depths of my soul, thank you." Hotar nodded once his gaze fixed on the small pouch where she secured the flowers. "The child's fever." "How long?" "Since yesterday," she replied. He shook his head. "These alone may not be enough. The fever is strong this season." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "There is another way, a stronger medicine. But you must trust me." The setting sun cast long shadows as they descended the canyon, a healer and a warrior, united by a singular purpose. Hotar moved with silent grace, pausing occasionally to gather other plants, a strip of bark from a specific tree, a gnarled root he dug from the hard-packed earth. "These will strengthen the sky tears," he explained, noticing her watchful gaze. "The fever comes from a sickness in the water. Many children have fallen ill." As they neared the edge of her property, the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky, Viola's anxiety surged. When her small adobe house came into view, a single lamp glowing in the window, she nearly wept with relief. Mrs. Hernandez emerged. As they approached, her eyes widening at the sight of Hotar. She crossed herself quickly, her hand trembling. "Catherine," Viola asked, sliding from her horse, her legs unsteady. "No change," the old woman replied, her frightened gaze never leaving the Apache warrior. "The fever still burns." Inside, Catherine was a small, frail form on the bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Viola's heart clenched. "Mama," Catherine whispered, her eyes glazed and unfocused. "I'm here, my love." Viola knelt, brushing the damp curls from her daughter's forehead. She was acutely aware of Hotar standing in the doorway, his tall frame a silhouette against the night. Mrs. Hernandez hovered nervously, her fear a palpable presence in the small room. "It's all right, Mrs. Hernandez," Viola said gently. "This is Hotar. He has come to help." The old woman hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I will pray for the child," she whispered, pulling her shawl tight before slipping out into the darkness. Alone with Hotar and Catherine, Viola felt a strange mixture of terror and hope. What must we do? Hotar approached the bed, his movements deliberate and respectful. He knelt opposite Viola, his gaze softening as he studied Catherine's face. "First, we prepare the medicine." In the small kitchen, they worked side by side over the fire. Hotar showed her how to crush the leaves and roots, how to measure with his fingers, his lips moving in a low, rhythmic chant in his native tongue. He worked with a reverence that transformed the simple act of preparing herbs into a sacred ritual. "Now," he said, his dark eyes serious, "we must cool her body while the medicine works from within." Cold cloths changed often. Through the long, desperate night, they became a team. Viola administered the bitter-smelling concoction, a spoonful at a time, while Hotar placed cool, damp cloths on Catherine's forehead, chest, and wrists. He showed her pressure points on Catherine's feet that he said would help the medicine travel faster, and he sang low, haunting songs that seemed to ease the child's restless tossing. The melodies were like the wind and the water, ancient and powerful. And Viola found herself mesmerized, her own fear momentarily soothed by the sound. Near dawn, the miracle happened. Catherine's fever broke. Her breathing eased, her body relaxed, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep for the first time in days. Viola, exhausted beyond words, finally let the tears of relief slide down her cheeks. "She will heal now," Hotar said softly. "The worst has passed." "I don't know how to thank you," Viola whispered, knowing the words were entirely inadequate for the gift he had given her. Hotar shook his head. No child should suffer when healing is possible. He rose, gathering his few belongings. "I must go before the sun rises. It is not safe for me to be seen here." Viola knew he was right. An Apache man found at a white woman's home would face immediate danger. Yet she was reluctant to see him leave. "Wait," she said, hurrying to her supply cabinet. She gathered packets of herbs and medicines, things she thought might be useful to his people. "Please take these. For your tribe's healer." Hotar accepted the gift with quiet dignity. "You have knowledge that could help my people, as I have knowledge that helped your daughter." He studied her face for a long moment, an unreadable expression in his eyes. "Perhaps this is not our last meeting, Viola Barnes." He slipped away into the pre-dawn shadows, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Viola stood in her doorway, watching the spot where his silhouette had merged with the juniper trees, a profound sense of change settling over her. A bridge had been built between two worlds, a connection forged in desperation and strengthened by a shared act of healing. Inside her, daughter slept safe and peaceful. A new day was dawning, and Viola knew with absolute certainty that her life and her heart would never be the same. A forbidden love blossomed in the weeks that followed, nurtured in stolen moments under the vast New Mexico sky. Their meetings began as an exchange of knowledge. By the light of a half-moon at the hidden waterfall that was now their sanctuary, Hotar taught Viola the healing ways of his people. He showed her plants that cured pain by the shape of their leaves and roots that drew out poison. In return, Viola shared her knowledge from the medical journals of Virginia, explaining techniques for setting bones and the uses of remedies brought from across the ocean. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond medicine to the stories of their lives. Hotar spoke of the encroaching settlers of the sacred lands lost and of the struggle to keep his people's traditions alive. Viola, in turn, confessed the painful details of her past, the shame of her out-of-wedlock pregnancy, the cold rejection of her family, and the bitter abandonment by Elias Thorne. "They called me ruined," she said one evening, her voice soft, her fingers trailing in the cool water of the pool. "Your people have strange ideas of shame." Hotar observed, his gaze steady. "Among my tribe, a child is a blessing regardless of how it comes. A man who does not acknowledge his child is no man at all." His words were a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still raw. The respect between them slowly, inevitably grew into something more. Viola found herself watching the son's position with anticipation, her heart quickening at the thought of seeing him. And she saw a similar longing in his eyes, a gentleness that belied his warrior's exterior. Meanwhile, a darker shadow was gathering on the horizon. Silas Thorne was not a man to let a debt go unpaid. He had returned to the territory not as a bank robber, but as something far more dangerous, a relentless bounty hunter with a singular focus. He began asking questions in redemption, his inquiries veiled but persistent. He used his resources to learn about the town's resident healer, the woman from back east with a dark-haired child. He also began to sow seeds of poison. Rumors, subtle at first, started to circulate through the town. Viola was seen gathering herbs too close to Apache territory. She treated Mexican families, and even it was whispered the natives themselves. She was an outsider, a sympathizer, a woman of questionable morals living alone. The whispers grew louder, feeding on the fear and prejudice that simmered just beneath the surface of frontier life. The few friendly nods she received in town became wary glances. Doors that had once been open to her were now quietly closed. Viola felt the chill of isolation, but it was a fear she kept hidden from Hotar, not wanting to burden him with her troubles. Their time together was a fragile escape from the harsh realities of their separate worlds. One night, as a storm gathered over the distant mountains, their carefully maintained distance finally collapsed. Hotar had arrived at the waterfall with a tension in his shoulders she had never seen before. "Soldiers," he said, his voice grim. "They burn our winter camps, claiming retaliation for cattle that were never stolen. A man named Lieutenant Davis leads them. He is a man who enjoys cruelty." The name sent a shiver down Viola's spine. Davis had visited her home, his polite inquiries barely masking a leering interest. She confessed this to Hotar, and saw a flash of protective fury in his eyes. "We cannot continue to meet like this," he said, his voice heavy with a regret that mirrored her own. "Why not?" she challenged, her heart aching at the thought. "Your life would be forfeit. Catherine would have no mother." he said, his hand rising to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the turmoil in his eyes. This is madness. Yes, she whispered, leaning into his touch. Beautiful madness. When their lips met, it was with the desperate urgency of two souls who had found their other half in a world determined to keep them apart. The storm broke, then the heavens weeping upon the land, as they held each other, two worlds colliding in a kiss that was both a beginning and a premonition of the end. In the following weeks, their love deepened, but so did the danger. Viola began having fragmented memories of Elias, not the charming lover she remembered, but a man with a darker side, a gambler, a drinker, a man prone to desperate schemes. The memories were unsettling whispers of a truth she had long suppressed. The confrontation she had been dreading arrived on a suffocatingly hot afternoon. A horseman rode up to her small home, and her blood ran cold. It was Silas Thorne. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate confidence, his cold gray eyes taking in the small herb garden, the modest house, and Catherine, who was playing near the doorway. "Mrs. Barnes," he said, his voice a mockery of politeness, "we have unfinished business." "I have nothing for you," Viola said, moving to stand between him and her daughter. Silas's gaze fell on Catherine, and a strange, complex emotion flickered across his face. Not hatred, but something akin to a painful recognition. "You are mistaken," he said, his eyes returning to Viola. "You have something that belongs to my family." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The man in the locket. My brother Elias." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Your brother?" "My younger brother Silas," confirmed his voice, laced with a bitterness that had festered for years. "A good boy before he met you. You filled his head with foolish dreams, dragged him down into your world of disgrace, and then you left him to die. You ruined him. You killed him." The accusation was so monstrous, so far from the truth, that Viola could only stare at him in stunned silence. "I have come to collect on that debt." Silas continued, his gaze flicking to Catherine again. "Elias's daughter does not belong with a woman like you. She is a thorn. She is my blood. I am taking her." The terror that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks erupted. This was not about prejudice or revenge against a stranger. This was a deeply personal vendetta, a twisted quest for family redemption. Silas Thorne had not come to harm her. He had come to erase her, to take the only thing that gave her life meaning. "You will not touch her," Viola said, her voice shaking but resolute, as she pushed Catherine behind her. The line had been drawn. The hunt was over, and a new, more desperate battle had just begun. The world shrank to the dusty patch of ground between Viola's home and the juniper trees. "You will not take my daughter," she repeated, her voice low and fierce. Silas Thorne offered a cold smile. "She is not your daughter. She is my niece, the last of my bloodline. You are merely the vessel that carried her. Your purpose is fulfilled." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Viola. She knew she could not fight him alone. Before he could make a move, she grabbed Catherine's hand and fled, not towards the town that had already turned its back on her, but towards the only sanctuary she had left, the wilderness and Hotar. Their escape was a desperate, chaotic flight into the mountains. Viola met Hotar at a prearranged emergency spot, a hidden canyon marked by ancient pictographs. When she gasped out the story of Silas's identity and his terrible claim, Hotar's face hardened into a mask of stone. He looked at Catherine, now his to protect as much as hers, and made a solemn vow. He will not have her. We will go to Mexico. Beyond the border, his reach ends. Thus began their perilous journey south. It was a flight for their lives, a grueling odyssey through treacherous terrain. They were no longer just a healer, a warrior, and a child. They were a family forged in crisis, their survival dependent on their combined skills. Hotar's knowledge of the land was their compass. He led them along forgotten game trails and through hidden passes, his senses alive to every sound, every track, every sign of pursuit. Viola's medical knowledge was their shield. She treated their injuries, found edible plants, and nursed Catherine through a bout of fever brought on by exhaustion and fear. Catherine, in turn, became their beacon of hope, her childish resilience, a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. They were hunted. Silas Thorne was not alone. He had assembled a posse of hard men drawn by the bounty he had placed on Hotar and the promise of a reward for the return of his niece. They were relentless, their pursuit, a constant pressure at their backs. Days blurred into a nightmare of hard-riding cold camps and watchful nights. Sleep was a luxury snatched in brief, fearful intervals. Once they were nearly caught. They had taken shelter for the night in a shallow cave, when the distant sound of horses sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Hotar, moving with silent speed, led them deeper into the rock formations, finding a narrow crevice, where they huddled together, scarcely breathing as the posse passed so close they could hear the men's rough voices and the creak of saddle leather. In the darkness, Viola clutched Catherine, whose small body trembled against her, and felt Hotar's hand find hers, a steady, reassuring pressure that said, "We are in this together." The constant flight took its toll. They were exhausted, hungry, and their hope was beginning to fray. They knew they could not outrun Silas forever. They needed to make a stand, but on ground of their own choosing. Hotar knew of such a place. An old silver mine, he told Viola one evening as they shared a meager meal of roasted rabbit. The Ghost Mountain Mine. It is a maze of tunnels, a place where 3 can fight as 30. But it is also a trap. Once inside, there is only one way out. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only one. They pushed their horses to the limit, finally reaching the abandoned mine as a fierce storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled through the canyons, tearing at the skeletal remains of the mining operation. They led their horses into the main adit, just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The air inside the mine was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and forgotten ghosts. A low rumble echoed from deep within the mountain. The storm was causing the old timbers to groan, the very rock to shift. The mine was unstable, a ticking clock that added another layer of danger to their already impossible situation. They didn't have to wait long. Silas Thorne and his men appeared at the mine entrance, dark silhouettes against the storm-lashed sky. Nowhere left to run. Barnes Silas's voice boomed, echoing unnaturally in the tunnel. "Give me my niece, and I will let you and your savage walk away." "She is not your niece," Viola shouted back, her voice swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. "She is my daughter." Hotar pulled Viola and Catherine deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels. "He will come in," he whispered. "He is too proud not to finish this himself." As if on cue, Silas ordered his men to hold the entrance and strode into the mine alone, a lantern in one hand, his Colt in the other. The final confrontation had begun. The climax unfolded in the flickering hellish light of Silas's lantern. The storm raged outside, and inside the mountain groaned around them, loose pebbles skittering down the tunnel walls. The mine was dying, and they were trapped in its belly. Elias was weak. Silas shouted, his voice echoing through the darkness as he stalked them through the maze of tunnels. He had a good name, a future. And you, a fallen woman with nothing to offer you, poisoned him with your cheap affections. You convinced him to steal our family's inheritance to fund some worthless venture. And when it failed, he took his own life in shame. He rounded a corner, his lantern light catching them in a dead-end shaft. He stood before them, his face a mask of righteous fury, his gun leveled at Hotar. He would still be alive, if not for you. Catherine would have a father. I am simply correcting a historical wrong. Viola stared at him, the missing pieces of her past finally clicking into place. Elias's desperation, his talk of a single all-or-nothing investment, his sudden disappearance. It hadn't been abandonment. It had been despair. "You're wrong," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I loved him. I would have helped him." "Love," Silas scoffed. "You wouldn't know the meaning of the word. You are a parasite." At that moment, as Silas prepared to fire, Hotar spoke, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the man's rage. "You lie." Silas froze, his attention shifting to the Apache warrior. "My people have connections," Hotar said, his eyes boring into Silas. "We listen to whispers the white man does not hear." A stable hand in Virginia, a man who fled west after seeing something he should not have. He told my cousins a story about two brothers who argued late one night in a study. An argument about money, about an inheritance that one brother felt was being squandered by the other. The color drained from Silas's face. The foundation of his entire vengeful crusade began to crumble. There was a gunshot. Hotar continued, his voice relentless. The stable hand saw the older brother Silas standing over the younger Elias, a smoking pistol in his hand. He saw Silas place the gun in his dead brother's hand to make it look like he had taken his own life. The secondary twist landed with the force of a physical blow. Silas Thorne's carefully constructed reality shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The righteous avenger was a fraud. The monster he had been hunting for years was himself. Lies. He screamed a raw, wounded sound of pure agony. His grief and guilt, so long projected onto Viola, now turned inward, and he snapped. He fired wildly, not at them, but at the rotting timber supports holding up the ceiling of the shaft. The mountain roared in protest. Timbers splintered and rock and earth began to cascade down. The tunnel was collapsing. In the chaos, Silas lunged for Catherine. "She is mine," he shrieked, his mind completely broken. Viola reacted on pure instinct. She shoved Catherine behind her and brought her small knife up in a desperate defensive arc. The blade caught Silas in the arm, forcing him to drop his lantern, which shattered on the ground, plunging them into near total darkness. Hotar tackled Silas, and the two men grappled in the collapsing tunnel. Viola, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, saw her chance. Silas's dropped revolver lay on the ground near her feet. She snatched it up, its weight heavy and cold in her hand. She aimed it at the writhing shape of Silas, her finger tightening on the trigger. Here was her chance to end it, to exact justice for the hell he had put them through. But as she looked at the broken man, she saw not a monster, but a tragic figure consumed by a lie of his own making. Killing him would make her no better. With a cry, she fired the gun not at Silas, but into the rock wall beside him. The muzzle flash illuminated his face, a mask of shock and despair. The shot was the final insult to the unstable mind. A huge section of the ceiling gave way, separating them from Silas. A wall of rock and earth thundered down, burying him completely. As the dust began to settle, there was only silence. "We must go," Hotar gasped, pulling Viola and Catherine back towards the main tunnel. "The whole mountain is coming down." They stumbled through the darkness, guided by the faint light of the storm-racked entrance, the mine collapsing behind them. A tomb for the man, and the lies that had driven him. They emerged from the dying mountain into the clean, rain-washed air, wounded and exhausted, but alive. The posse, seeing the mine's entrance collapse and assuming their employer was dead, had fled. They were finally free. They didn't look back. They mounted their horse and rode south, leaving the ghosts of New Mexico behind them. The crossing into Mexico was not a triumphant moment, but a quiet, exhausted passage. The shallow river that marked the border felt like a baptism, washing away the blood and dust of their long ordeal. They were scarred, bruised, and emotionally shattered, but they were together. They were a family. Hotar, guided by memories of his mother's stories, led them to a small, isolated village nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Madre. It was a place where the lines between cultures blurred, a sanctuary for those seeking refuge from the rigid world to the north. Hotar's distant relatives, his mother's cousins, welcomed them without question, offering them food, shelter, and the healing balm of acceptance. The weeks turned into months. The harsh memories of their flight began to fade, replaced by the gentle rhythms of their new life. The physical wounds healed, and slowly so did the emotional ones. Viola, with her healer's knowledge, became a respected figure in the village, her skills blending seamlessly with the traditional remedies of the local curandera. She taught the village women about hygiene during childbirth, and they in turn taught her about the potent herbs that grew on the mountainsides. Hotar found peace. He was no longer a warrior, fighting a losing battle, but a man of wisdom, teaching the village boys the tracking and hunting skills of the Apache. He found a new purpose in preserving his heritage, not through conflict, but through education. They built a small adobe house of their own, on a piece of land overlooking a valley, vibrant with life. It was a home built not on bloodlines or societal approval, but on a foundation of shared survival, mutual respect, and a love that had proven stronger than any border. One clear, cool morning, several months after their arrival, Viola stood on the hill beside their new home. In her hand, she held the locket which Hotar had recovered from Silas's body before the final collapse of the mine. She had cleaned the dirt from its silver surface, but she had not opened it. She no longer needed to. The past, with both its love and its pain, had been faced and overcome. Hotar came to stand beside her, Catherine, trailing behind him, her hands full of wildflowers. Together, at the base of a young sapling they had planted a week before, they dug a small hole in the rich earth. Viola looked at the locket one last time, then gently placed it in the ground. It was an act of burial, but also of planting. She was letting go of Elias Thorne, of the ghost who had haunted her for so long, and in its place, she was planting roots for a new future. As Hotar covered the locket with soil, Catherine placed her wildflowers on the freshly turned earth. She looked up at them, her dark eyes bright and full of a happiness that had been absent for too long. Later that afternoon, Viola found her sitting in the shade of the sapling, drawing in the dirt with a stick. She was sketching a picture. It was a simple, childish drawing, but its meaning was profound. It showed a small house, a tall man with long hair, a woman with a kind smile, and a little girl holding both their hands. It was a picture of her new complete family. It was a picture of home.